Welcome to the Avast Hacker Archives. This is a new series that uncovers the aha moments that hackers and researchers have had over the course of their careers. I'm Jaya Baloo, CISO at Avast, and today's guest is Dave Aitel. He's the founder of the Aitel Foundation, the founder and CEO of Immunity, and he's also one of the 15 most influential people in security. He's also a really well-known keynote speaker. He's been at all these industry events like BlackHat and DEFCON. That's where I met him. He's a co-author of the Hacker's Handbook, amongst a whole bunch of other popular hacking books. And he's the founder of the awesome Infiltrate Offensive Security Conference, which I feel like I need a personal invitation to. Thank you again for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I should mention that I'm actually no longer with Immunity and therefore no longer associated with Infiltrate officially or the CEO, but I know that's all right. It's I can't even keep up with the changes in the world right now. I'm mostly focusing on a couple different charitable organizations that I'm working with. One of which is the No Starch Press Foundation, which I'm sure you've heard about, and the other one is my own little foundation, which is mostly oriented around local projects here in Miami, where I can sort of see things happening on the ground. But other than that, it was a perfect biography. Thank you so much.
Well, let's start about talking about where really got you started into cybersecurity and what your first hacking experience was. I mean, where did you have your first moment of this is awesome, I love this, I want to do this, and I want to keep doing it?
There was a very influential book that came out back like in 1985, back in the era of Neuromancer and Snow Crash that few people have read, and it's called The Long Run by Daniel Keyes Moran. And I was definitely in the crew of kids in your local high school who played Dungeons and Dragons, were largely socially unaware of the world around them. Like, picking on me didn't make a lot of sense because I didn't understand what was happening. My stepfather had purchased a computer, which he locked behind a door. And I've always found that the best way to get a kid to learn how to hack is to tell them to just never use the computer. Just like punish them when they get on the computer. Like, no computer time is allowed. And they will find a way to learn how to erase logs before you have the time to instruct them on that sort of thing. It's really quite good. So, I mean, when I would come home from school, I would pick the lock to the door. I would get on early BBSs. I would play Trade Wars, which was the game of the time. I'm sure you've actually played similar bulletin board games.
Yeah.
And it sort of evolved from there in terms of, I was lucky because my school had like a programming class, which was not normal for high school in those days. After high school, I ended up applying for a scholarship from the National Security Agency. So they had a program where they would recruit people of color and pay for college, and then those people would work there after the NSA had paid for their college. So I managed to get one of those scholarships, which was good because my high school grades were not good. Very bad. Very, very bad. Which, just to continue my horrible story, I left. I actually took a graduate class in computer security in college because I was working still at the time for the National Security Agency. I'm like, I should really learn the security thing that I've heard so much about. I got a C. It was actually my worst grade that I got in college throughout all of my college career. It turns out I'm not good at computer security. So in case anyone's curious, that's how it works. You can still, in some level, succeed in industry knowing only an average amount of computer security. That's how I got started. That's the basic truth of it. I don't know if there was a time when I was like, oh, this is for me, so much as like, I think there's a lot of us who are just driven to do whatever the geekiest thing is that you can do at the moment. And computer security offers a very geeky challenge that will eat your whole brain.
Yes.
As you know.
Yes, as I know. But I get that you probably can't share a lot more than what you just told me now in terms of what you've done with the NSA, but is there something, I don't know, super juicy, I'm thinking equation group style stuff that you did that would be declassified or not so classified or clearly part of Tau or anything else that you could share?
I think the only story that I publicly share is the one about the parking lots. So the thing about that era, the era that I was at the NSA, is that it was before hackers
Okay.
were a thing. But I was sort of like one of the very few people who was already, like, I'd been to 2,600 meetings, and I went to like a cypherpunks meeting, and I met like some of I think it was Diffie who was there at some
right.
brownstone
Yeah.
in the middle of DC, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" Because they sort of like they assumed the NSA was like the enemy, and I'm like, the NSA is just full of cypherpunks. That's like the literal like ethos of the building, is that you can change the world by doing cryptography. I mean, where else would I be? Which confused the hell out of them. So, I was working very weird hours because I was a baby, right? Like, we all start this career as like larval forms. And I drove up every day. I would park in the special reserved slots at the very front of the building because the parking lot was like 2 miles long. And I was working like bizarre hours. And I'm like, these are the only spots I can do. I'm working like noon to midnight or whatever. The only spot available and I was probably late, to be honest, was like the one right at the door, which is reserved for the director of the NSA. So, and I'm not driving a nice car. I'm driving a 1985 Toyota Camry with a big Free Kevin sticker on the back, right? Like big slapped up bumper. It's like, it looks terrible. So eventually they looked up whose car this was because they're like, maybe they had cameras on it. I don't know what it was, but they were like, so they're calling up my management and they're making a big deal about it. They're like, Dave, you can't keep parking in the director spot. That's like the director spot. Or like, like the deputy director has a spot. None of them were ever used because I was working in some random building. And like, I guess the theory is if they ever had to drive through, but they would just park in the spot next. It wasn't really an issue. It was just a status thing. And also if everyone did this, it would be a problem, but it's just me doing it. So I didn't see the issue. So I guess there's also an element of like government workers where they do tend to follow rules more than I did. That was probably a thing. 21-year-old me was definitely not the best employee.
But what did they do? Did they roofie you? Did they like carry you out in a gunny sack? What did they do?
Very annoyed. But it was like one of 60 things they were very annoyed at me for because of this particular habit I had of breaking rules. And so, I mean, at the time, as you drove into the building, the motto of the NSA was one team, one mission. And so when they started getting annoyed at me, I was very publicly, sort of big internal mailing list. I was like, it's one team, one parking lot. Because I believed in
equality for parking spots.
Yeah. It became sort of like I don't know, it was a very amusing event because it was so public in the internal spheres. Obviously, no one external really cared or knew. But to me, it was almost like a watershed of like, there is going to be a lot of change that was about to happen to the NSA that they knew about. So if you look like externally, people have talked about all these sort of programs to modernize what the NSA did. And you can look at the public histories and you can see them moving from SIGINT to, active SIGINT or whatever you'd call this stuff, right?
Yeah.
But internally, there's a cultural change as well, which was, to me, the watershed event of one team, one parking lot. So that was sort of, I mean, there were other times like the head of the base tried to throw me off the base at one point because I pointed out that they were distributing the password to the local military website in a newsletter that you could get. Just anyone could pick it up. And I was like, this is terrible. And they were like, it was sort of like vulnerability disclosure does not make you popular, even in an enclosed circle. So like, I mean, I can't really talk about what I did without going through pre-publication review. And weirdly enough, I'm reading a new law paper on potentially revising pre-publication review, which I don't think will ever happen, but it would be a good thing if it did. But I don't know. So it's sort of like, I don't see the NSA like 20 years ago. I don't see the NSA as the same way a lot of people did. I definitely see it from the perspective of an organization that went through a ton of change and has adjusted really well to the new world, which I think is a marker of its unique structural style and place in the world. It's humongous to a scale that like a Google or a Microsoft would be. It has a homogenous culture of people who do not do drugs or even drink too much. Like that homogeny is that sort of enforced clearance homogeny is beneficial in some ways. It has a technical director style so that you have two management tracks, one of which is management and one of which is technical directors, which is really rare in private industry. Like, maybe I think Microsoft might have something like this, but it's pretty rare. And it's like if you looked at what they did yesterday, so I thought it was very interesting. Yesterday, they posted like the director of the NSA personally recorded a video about Pride Month. But like the director of CISA did not. And I don't know about the directors of other organizations. Like I didn't see one from the FBI. I didn't see one from other organizations. But that, there's more LGBTQ members of our community than there are religious members.
That's right.
Like, it's the culture is very different from the culture of the FBI, say, which was a bunch of cops, or the culture of the military, which has been enforced homophobia for so long. And I think this is like that cultural change within the organization has been a real amazing thing to watch from, both the inside and the outside.
Let's talk about other stuff like post NSA. I mean, all right, you no longer do immunity. I didn't know that, but it's pretty cool what you did with Canvas and ImmunitySec and, Infiltrate. Like, how did you go from being the guy that did the thing to being the guy that built the thing?
It's funny because all of the managers at Immunity were extremely technical. And I think that's what kept us sane. It wasn't just me, honestly. Boss Alberts, Nicholas Weissman were there the whole time pretty much. But there was also a very large crew of us who together had a very technical focused family before it was sort of as popular as it is now. And I'd sort of just liken it to the little hacker crews that started up in the 90s, but with a corporate, bent so that we could pay the bills. I never thought like hacking made a bunch of money, right? Like, so I think part of the problem is people watch like or read New York Times or Forbes articles about like the hacker market and think people are making bank off this.
Yeah.
Do the numbers, they're not, right? No. Because if selling a vulnerability in any of these products or doing pen testing or building Canvas, you're probably going to break even, is the honest truth. You have to just love that kind of technology. You have to love looking at the abyss in a certain way. Like the holes in a system have to fascinate you, even when the clients are being absolute monsters to you, which I know you've done some consulting, and I know that like part of consulting is both the most and least fun you can have for $40,000. You know what I mean? Like you will have clients who think your vulnerabilities that you're sort of helping them with are worthless until the very end, at which point, why didn't you give us more information? So the whole fun of the client management stuff, I tried to make some of that less painful for my team, but there's no way to make it not painful. It's painful every time.
Yeah.
And I think it just grew organically.
Without talking about the clients themselves, like what part of it was really difficult? Was it actually, having an ungrateful client or coming back and finding stuff that was still broken or more broken and still, I mean, what was the word?
I will say a good project manager is so important because they are the buffer between the fact that the client doesn't view your vulnerabilities as worth fixing and the fact that your consultants view them as ultimate critical things. And neither one is right. But you do the project. I think it's interesting that like people view project managers as glorified Gantt chart things when most of the work is like managing the two different like equities between the two different groups that you're trying to get to work together. And so I found that that was always very fascinating to me. And I spent a lot of time working with our project managers, almost more time than I spent working with the consultants. But the payoff is that I got to read 10 years worth of consulting reports, which is something that most people don't. That's like an information feed. It's like getting the presidential daily brief every morning. You don't normally get that. And so it was a lot of work and a lot of fun. And I actually kind of miss that understanding of what's broken all the time. I miss that.
I totally understand that. Hey, but like, what, this is really something unique that you guys had this type of organization to facilitate those consultants and those hackers to get to a place where they could actually report and then get like feedback on what was going on. A lot of hackers out there that want to make cash doing this kind of work don't have this. They don't have this infrastructure support. They usually, don't have a good communication mechanism to go and report. They don't know how to defend themselves if there's any kind of legal action that could go.
I worry every day about bug bounties blowing up in people's faces because they have no legal protection and there's nowhere to go when a big company decides to throw its team against you. In order for a small consulting team to do the first day of work, you have to already have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal documents and insurance programs and all sorts of other stuff to backstop what realistically is your worst case scenario. Because even with your own good lawyers and stuff, you're still going to go out of business and you will probably lose your house. But you will have a sort of brief buffer of time while you can enjoy your private life. So I think that you're right. There's a lot of risk out there being pushed onto people who have no ability to handle that risk. And yet consulting and the rest of the market still has not managed to solve some of these problems, right? So I think it's very funny that, for example, people look at vulnerability announcements and patching as a key part of their security strategy, when it's more likely that the big software vendors are using them as a key part of their public relations strategy. Like I am astonished that a vulnerability comes out in a big VPN vendor and people patch it and think they're okay now. What they should be doing is ripping those VPNs off their network and replacing them with something that has a better history of security. Because they're super exposed. The vulnerabilities that are in them are catastrophic to your business presence, could end your business. Yet the vendors have convinced you that patching it and just moving forward with your life is an acceptable plan. It blows my mind. And it's sort of like this capture of the mindset that is just fascinating and amazing.
Well, isn't it, weird for a vendor to go out there and say, we know about this vulnerability, we've seen it exploited in the wild, go patch now, but without necessarily leaving advice how to find out if you should be in a post-exploitation phase and doing forensics?
Or you're not even legally allowed to do post-exploitation and analysis and forensics because you're not allowed on the appliance that they sold you, right? They have an encrypted file system and you can't even get the files off that thing. You have no idea how bad your problem was. And they want that because if you knew how bad your problem could be, you would immediately ask for your money back. So I think there's going to be some major shifts in industry, and I'm hoping that the government can guide or the US government in this case. I cannot speak for the government of the Netherlands.
I think the point that you're trying to make is valid, but I think look, let's be honest. The majority of the software industry that the whole planet depends on is still coming out of Western countries. It's still a lot of the US companies that we see that are used globally. And I do agree that I don't think we have a way to look at just how bad is it. If you're looking vulnerability to vulnerability, you don't necessarily have a sort of gamut analysis of, common protocol issues or common third-party components or So,
a paper came out today from Google about how hardware processors, like cores as they call it, have fleeting errors that they are now having to detect on a mass scale, which is something that I know Halvar Flake talked about a lot and is like, we saw the hints of this problem, 5 years ago. Now they're saying it's a definite problem and it affects security, of course. And we still don't have any hope of solutions, which I think is we're reacting slowly as a community. It may be that there's too much money in the system. I don't know what the issue is, but I know also Huawei came out with Harmony OS today.
With what?
Harmony OS.
Oh,
named Harmony.
Oh yes, of course.
Very
Yes.
Dystopian. But what if they win? Right? I think you and I would both say, okay, most of the software is developed in the West, even though I think India has a large software base, and to many is the West, I guess.
Yeah.
West of China, because I think I don't know what. So, I don't know necessarily that that the status quo is here forever, right? Like it may be that, look, my kids play lots of video games. Every video game company is owned by China.
Mm-hmm.
Like Fortnite is I think 30% owned by China, and so is every other video game company. A lot of them are straight up owned by China. Some of the top games are, and so I think we think that we have this sort of built-in monopoly on software design and development, but it's not true.
Let's be honest, we've seen enough software vulnerabilities, but also potential hardware stuff that we don't understand enough about, like Spectre, Meltdown, the whole Supermicro, what if. So there's too much stuff that I think that's going to be really difficult to do. And I think that's why, I'm really like a big fan of the SBOM initiative to look at a like software bill of materials. And the challenge with that, I think, is multifold, but I find like even the idea of taking that from idea to implementation just mind-boggling.
Well, you got 90 days, right? 90. Like, I don't even know what it's like to be a big vendor right now and have to look at that executive order and try to figure out how you're going to meet any of those timelines. So I feel for you on that one.
Yay! So, there's also this part where I think like we genuinely don't have a sort of food label on whatever it is we're buying as consumers or consuming as companies when it comes to our stuff. I do think, though, that there's a strong supposition for this 0-day market. So everybody thinks there's this like magic 0-day market where if you really want to go and find the bad guys and like stop them, you need to do stuff with the 0-day market. What are your views on O-days?
And I have so many views on O-days, but the thing about O-days is it's not a technical term that you can define, right? So I always find it very fun when it's like if people use the term gnarly as like a technical term. They're like, how do you think about gnarly 360s? And I'm like, well, like you're thinking like, what is that? And I'm like, yeah, what is that? Because the term doesn't mean anything in particular. So my favorite thing about it is that when I say something is an O-day, I'm making a supposition about what everyone else in the world knows. I'm saying here's a vulnerability or a feature or something that I know and that I also don't think anybody else knows. But that's sometimes the O-days that we see used and labeled as O-days are printed up in Russian antivirus magazines. And we find that out 5 years later. So is something not an O-day in retrospect? How does time work exactly? I know you're into the point. But I would say that like there's been a lot of recent focus on O-days because a book came out that was salaciously written and largely wrong from a popular journalist, right? So the problem with how we deal with our entire world is that it's covered in sort of this fog of war. It's very technical. It's very cloistered, right? Everyone's got either clearances or private NDAs or who knows what. So it's very hard to make large-scale strategic policy decisions on something nobody can talk about, right? Like no one's talking about Fight Club, therefore we can't talk about like what best medical insurance is for your underground fighting ring or something like that, right? So I think that the truth about all these issues is that it is best to make decisions with as much information as possible. And with the expert understanding of the issues. That's not what you see in the public space typically, but it's also not completely out of bounds for private government organizations, which do understand many of these issues. So I guess I would come back to another science fiction book and just say we just don't panic about these things.
Yes. Okay. But without having a sort of panic response or necessarily having a complete picture, there are phenomenon like zero-day markets where you can purchase 0 days. And there are various host of actors that are in these places. So what I am worried about are the young hackers that, also don't have the infrastructure to support them. Would they have legal action when they're doing vulnerability disclosure? Also not be able to recognize an O-Day, but thinking that they can get the cash, more than going to the company themselves by going to one of these slightly lugubrious markets.
I mean, I'm sure they can get the cash more than going to the company themselves. The company treats them as an enemy and as a PR problem.
Yeah.
So, of course, they're not going to view them as an external contractor that you didn't have in your budget. Like, that's not how their budget works. So, but an offensive team is going to view them as, on the critical path to success. That's just the way the money's going to flow. And I think that was like, even today, the Pigeon author complained that he makes $25,000 to work on Pigeon every year, and Zerodium was offering $100,000 for a Pigeon bug.
Yeah,
he's like, that's maybe he should put a bug in Pigeon, sell it to Zerodium,
right,
and then fix it himself later when he feels like it, right? So all these issues are pretty wrapped up in a lot of complex geopolitics. I will say part of what's happening now is people think the West also, in addition to building all the software that's in the vulnerabilities, has some sort of monopoly that's natural in terms of finding and exploiting vulnerabilities. Or they think that it's something that only very large countries can do. When I've recently been very, very impressed by the Egyptians are super good right now. They're making good bugs. They're doing great work, right? Like, is that a country that you expected?
No, I did not. But tell me about the Egyptian team. Yeah.
Good people doing good work. Very technical. There's people think that this is something that is done only in, Western. I don't know. They really do think some weird things about this space.
Yeah, no, I used to work in Egypt. This is why it's good to hear. I used to work out of Cairo for a DSL provider. But
I don't know that I'll ever probably visit Egypt. I mean, it would be cool, but I've been watching them just in the public space and saying, look, that's some great work. I'm impressed, right? And the fact is, people can skill up. You have to acknowledge that this is not a sphere where if we control the markets, then everyone else will just lay off. No, they have their own things. If they're buying stuff, they're doing it to supplement what they have. So, I mean, I personally think the Chinese are probably the best in the world right now. They don't need the markets. They are the market, right? And they've built the talent over 2 decades of work.
Mm-hmm.
I think, we like to refer to them as a near peer. I think we might be the near peer, which is a harsh thing to think, but that's just the reality of life. So I think that's one of the things. People think if we control the markets, we will do something useful, right? But you won't. So maybe we're spending too much energy on it.
so if we go back to this energy thing, what would you like to spend our energy on, which would actually have a noticeable impact and difference in terms of where we are today with InfoSec?
I think it's fun because I think we could, if we wanted to literally noticeably improve, we could just stop using PHP and Perl and not buy stuff that has PHP and Perl in it. Just never do it. None of no WordPress, no random Perl stuff on your VPN box that's exposed to the world. Just none of that. Just get rid of it, move on. And I think you see okay. And the other thing you could do is build a world without JavaScript. JavaScript can't be secured, right? And specifically, the JIT can't be secured. But JavaScript, everyone should just not be using JavaScript, right? So it's sort of like Flash, but people don't realize it yet. So if we do those two things, people will stop getting hacked as much. But we're not going to take.
I see a T-shirt. I see a T-shirt design coming up. Just don't do the following.
Simple rules to when something gets owned, take it off your network and put it in the penalty box for a year.
Yeah.
Right. If your 9-year-old steals all the cookies, no more dessert this week. It's super simple.
Let's talk about things that really made your life. I mean, beyond just work, where are the moments where you thought, okay, this is really cool what I'm doing. I love this, but I also really want to do this and I want to add this to my community or my country.
Well, I've been doing 2 things lately now that I no longer have immunity. to focus all of my anxiety on. One of those things is working heavily in the government cyber policy area. So the government cyber policy area is very weird because we used to have almost nobody technical interface with like cyber policy stuff. And I know you did a lot of export control back in the day, but that was like a million years ago for you. I'm actually still doing a lot of export control, weirdly enough. And the reason I got into export control is
like Wassenaar export control, or where?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I work with the Information Systems Technical Advisory Committee under the Commerce Department when I can, and they are a group of experts that look at technology issues and try to make the Wassenaar stuff make at least sense, right? So export control often has metrics that they try to apply to a technology. So they want lasers of 2 watts to be allowed to be exported for a laser pointer, but not 50 watts because it would burn holes in airplanes or whatever your number is. But in the space of cybersecurity, we don't have any clear numbers, right? Like there's nothing to say that like a vulnerability or a pen testing platform is any different from something that would be used for ransomware, for example.
Of course, yeah.
And so what I've been trying to do is find ways to move our discussion of how this space is affected by export control from fanciful, crazy ideas to things that might have a hope of working. And in some cases, we have to admit export control is not the answer, which has been a very difficult discussion because right now, the Europeans have implemented very strict export controls and sometimes internal controls on information security technology. And the United States has not. And if you know anything about how export control works, I know you do, but perhaps the viewers do not. The reality is, unless you have a uniform code across the entire set, I would say I've been doing a lot of work with government policy, trying to make that. I have a very weirdly popular policy video channel on my YouTube where I go over like a paper that someone has written about cyber policy. And usually we critique it pretty harshly, but sometimes we don't. So I do live streams every week usually. And then I also have a blog full of policy ideas, and I've been talking to various things about that. So I've been doing a lot of cyber policy. And then the other side of my life right now is doing various charity efforts. So the No Starch Press Foundation is a really big one, and I'm the program committee chair for that. And then I also give to support some of the local needs that we have around Miami, one of which is Project Grapple, which actually the information security community has really been very amazing in supporting. Like it's this team, it's a school teacher who noticed he works in the inner city of Miami, in like the poorest neighborhood. And he put together a little wrestling program for like kids who had nothing. And it's been really good. And I saw him do it and I was like, wow, because I do jujitsu. And so I saw him doing it and I'm like, why are they raising money with t-shirts when I can, like fund enough so they can afford the very simple equipment they need, and then they don't have to raise t-shirts, which I find humiliating, right? So I've been supporting them, and then also local food bank and things like that, which during COVID was the lines were insane. It was harsh to watch. And the information security community has stepped up and is the largest contributor to Project Grapple to date, based on me sending out some Twitter messages. But we all do jujitsu in the information security community. And people, I think, said, well, I want to help. And this looks like it's not like he's pocketing 10% of the money. The person running Project Grapple turns everything into keeping kids who would never have an opportunity to do a lot of these things, and he makes sure that they get what they need. So it's been amazing giving back in that way. So you can go to aitelfoundation.org and just see what we're doing. It's not meant to raise money. It's just meant to be a little foundation to give back.
I love that. And I think a lot of people would love to do that. I think that especially after this past year and a half, everyone's kind of trying to figure out, am I doing enough? Because it was before we were just kind of in our little regular patterns and just going to work and doing the job and trying to contribute a little bit by doing the thing that we always did. But I think that this past year and a half has been saying, okay, what actually contributes to more meaningful things, more lasting things. So I think it's wonderful.
I think, and we're seeing more of this in our community. I mean, Bill Pollack, who does the No Starch Press and was the founder of the No Starch Press Foundation. I mean, this is sort of pre-COVID. And Michael Zalowiski, who you may know from as Elcom Tough, a major fuzzer inventor and many things, has just donated, I think, $100,000 to the No Starch Press Foundation. Wow. And Ron Gula has been really one of the founders of Tenable, has been really pushing forward with his program. I think a lot of minority and disadvantaged founders and things like that he's supporting. I think he gave away $1 million last year. So we're starting to see a change in the community, and I think a very healthy change where people are giving back and trying to evoke change in ways that go beyond mean Twitter messages. So, which I think is really good.
Yeah. Hey, and with all of the wisdom and the knowledge that, for the last, 20 years that you've had in the field, if you could go back and tell your younger self something to do or not to do, what would that thing be?
I was a fairly crazy, out of control, socially awkward, semi-alcoholic teenage, young adult. And I don't know that I could have done the things I've done without that, to be honest. Like, as much as it was abrasive and often just wrong, there's an aspect of what we do that requires a discipline of iconoclasty that means you're challenging everything. You're a rabid hyena, just biting everything's leg. And I just, as much as I'm very discomforted by who that person was.
So whatever happened, do you still talk to some of those folks from a long time ago, Halvar or Jeff or?
I talk to a lot of people. I would say that I like these people. It's funny because one of my friends here, brought me this 18-year-old or whatever. She's like, he is just the worst. I can't get through to him. And he's very geeky and we just don't know how to talk to him. He just wants to spend all his time programming. And I was like, I don't know, I'll take him out for a lunch or whatever. So I took him out for lunch because she's trying to get him to apply to college or something. And I'm like, this is the most normal kid I've ever met. Then I realized, actually, it's just that my bar for normalcy is set to very different levels.
Yeah.
I think that we operate differently as a culture. I really like our parts of our culture in terms of the just level of technical depth that most people have when you talk to them. And the interest in various subjects that are very weird. I have a big ant on my wall. People don't think it's that weird that I have what appears to be an unhealthy fascination with ants. So this culture would think that was very normal, but let me tell you, it does not do well on the old Bumble dating site, right? So as you can imagine. So I love our culture, of course. And I think there's an element of when people don't want to delve into why, I don't know, Perl is the worst language known to man and you should not use JavaScript. I just think, I don't know. So there's an aspect of that I get along with still, and I still talk to everybody about it. I would always go up at conferences and ask people what their favorite exploit was as my opener introduction, because it made sense in that context, and I like that bit of it.
Dave, it was a pleasure that you could join us today. And for all of you out there, thanks again for tuning in and listening to our conversation. And until the next time.